So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Caitlin Krause. I'm the Senior Director for Alumni Relations in the School of Engineering. We are so happy to have all of you here this evening for the launch of our UConn Impact Series. These events are meant to provide a look at how UConn is fostering a movement towards a more sustainable, just, and successful future through research, innovation, and education. So tonight, we are thrilled to have an outstanding panel of UConn faculty who are going to lead us in understanding the gravity of climate threat and a glimpse at the cutting-edge tools that they've developed with the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. These are designed to protect the communities that we're in. So we hope that you feel proud and inspired and motivated by the conversation today. I encourage you to ask questions. We hope that you will continue to stay involved and remain active members of our UConn community. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ofer Harel. He is the interim dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Dean Harel has been a leader within CLAS for many years, serving as the associate dean for research and graduate affairs, as well as the director of graduate admissions at the Department of Statistics. So, Dean Harel, thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Caitlin. Welcome, everyone, to the first event of the UConn Impact Series. What is exciting about this series is that this event brings together some of our most talented faculty from across the universities, schools, and colleges. They provide a glimpse of how UConn is making a difference in our state, our nation, and our world, through groundbreaking research and collaboration to solve some of the greatest challenges facing our communities. Climate change is, of course, a perfect example for this. There are so many biological, physical, engineering, economic, social, and legal problems wrapped up in this issue. In CLAS, we are proud to be inherently interdisciplinary. We know that working together across disciplines is the best way we can create meaningful change and tangible outcomes for our state and its people. I hope you enjoyed the discussion today and leave here feeling inspired by the colleagues in the School of Law, the College of Engineering, and of course the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences about what our coastal state is doing and can do better to mitigate the effect of climate change. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the discussion, Joe MacDougall. Professor MacDougall is a Stresser Fellow in the Environment Law, the Executive Director of the UConn Law Center of Energy and Environmental Law, the Director of LLM in Energy and Environmental Law, and the Faculty Advisor to the Energy, Environmental Law and Society. Please join me to welcome Professor MacDougall.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you, Ofer, for the kind words and introduction. I'm Joe MacDougall. I'm from the law school. I've been looking forward to this panel for several weeks since the foundation helped put it together, because it's like these are a few of my favorite things. Right? This is a group of some of my very favorite faculty members who do important work, who I think you'll be impressed with the scope of the way we approach climate change and climate policy at the university, but also in the way that we're impacting the state. With us are, well, they'll introduce themselves, but are people that are engaging, that have touched the state in some very significant ways, from your power, resilience, the way that we think about rainfall, and the complicated ways that Connecticut's climate is changing. We're really lucky. Not that many states have a university that's as engaged with the immediate policy making, as well as also right down to the municipal level. So with that, what I'd like to do is call upon, in order, each of them to introduce themselves and maybe talk a bit about their research and how it impacts Connecticut. We're gonna ask a few questions here up at the table, and probably answer some that we didn't think we were gonna ask, but then we really wanna open it up to each of you. whatever questions are on your mind, however issues that you think you have, we can talk about it, and really you're at a time where you're listening to a panel of people that approach the perspectives for the climate problem, both from the science, from sea level rise, from energy, and also from an educational basis. So why don't I start, if I could, with Professor Seth. I'm going to introduce yourself and your research.
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. I'm Angie Seth. My training is in atmospheric science, my PhD, and I have a degree also in engineering. And I'm department head of the geography department at UConn in Storrs. I have 30 years, give or take a few, it's hard to keep track now, of experience doing climate change research. Climate modeling, I work with the big numerical climate models. I've been involved in research that looks at climate variability and how our climate is changing for a long time. And so my research in climate has led to, as we'll probably talk about, I co-led the writing of a climate change assessment, a physical climate change assessment for Connecticut that was asked for by CIRCA and fed into the governor's climate change steering committee. And so that is one of the documents that has been used across the state to look at temperature and rainfall changes. So that's in part what I have been doing, but as department head in geography, I just want to add that I have been re-educated because, you know, climate science is a very kind of straight physical science. I've been re-educated to understand a lot more of the social science and historical issues and really understanding how important getting climate justice and environmental justice as a baseline for everything that we do with respect to climate. So I've been educated in that, and our department, geography, is very involved in environmental justice tools in the state and GIS mapping involved in the state and all of these things. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Angie.
Yeah.
Next is Professor Jim O'Donnell from Marine Sciences, but also the Executive Director of the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation.
Well, thanks for inviting me to speak today. So I'm a physicist originally, and then my PhD is in oceanography. And I've been at UConn for a long time, more than 30 years. I stopped counting about 7 ago. And the first 20, I worked on science associated with mixing and waves and turbulence in the ocean. And I published papers, and maybe a couple of hundred people read them. My mom and dad didn't even read them. But they were technical, and my friends liked them. But then about 10 years ago, we had 2 big storms here that caused severe flooding along the shoreline, and the Connecticut legislature required UConn and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to try and provide some advice to towns on what they should look forward to and plan for in order to try and reduce the losses and danger in the future. And so I got a job of kind of helping coordinate people, and including my colleagues here, to form a support institute that would be focused on providing solutions and advice to both to individuals and to town governments and state agencies about what they should expect and plan for looking forward. Now, at the time, I didn't really understand the scope of what that meant. And at first, I just thought that it was all about, like, how high is sea level going to be in Connecticut in the future, and what should towns and people who are building along the shoreline be required to plan for so that they are not going to be on the TV news during a hurricane with their stuff floating down the street. Right? And that is an important thing. And we with Joe's help, actually, the legislature adopted some of the recommendations that we made. But that was just the beginning. I realized
during the process of consultation with people around the state about what they were thinking, that that's just one narrow aspect. People don't build houses very often, right? And there's a small number of people who are affected relative to the rest of the state. But all across the state, people lost power, you know, and people care about that. And MANOS will tell you about what UConn's doing to make our grid resilient. But there's also a lot of other things that happen. Warming in the future is likely to create some stress for people who are medically compromised and live in cities and aren't very wealthy, especially if power goes out as well, right? So that's a different kind of problem. And so CIRCA has expanded to try and address a broader range of problems, and that requires a broader range of people. And the Institute's, my obligation to the Institute is to try and help coordinate faculty capacity across the university in engineering and science and statistics and law and mathematics, and to address these problems in an effective way. Not just study science and publish papers, but do that and also provide solutions and opportunities and policy advice to legislators and leaders around the state.
Thank you, Jim. Next is, and I'm delighted to introduce PASCHALINE ASARE, a recent lecturer appointment here at the law school, and also a key voice in one of our programs that are important to us, a Master's in Energy and Environmental Management. So, PASCHALINE, talk a little bit about your work.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for having me today. So my name is PASCHALINE, as Joe so eloquently introduced me. It's a pleasure to be here today. Almost feel like a relic in the law school, but I always have to go back to the genesis because I was exposed to climate issues because of UConn. So it's only fitting that I address this issue in this August audience. But my interest basically lies in comparative analysis. I look at how climate impacts, particularly within the energy grid, affect countries like my home country, Ghana. And I look at it through the lenses of a regional assessment. So as we know, in New England, we have the ISO New England that's responsible for administering the grid. And in developing countries such as Ghana and most countries in West Africa, we lack that coordination. And now that we're facing the brunt of climate change impacts, it's important that we start coordinating our efforts in planning resource adequacy as well as affordability in a way where we're addressing climate impacts. So for instance, we all know what just transition is, and if we don't know, we'll probably learn a little bit about that this evening. So just transition is not the same as it is for the global north that it is for the global south. And my approach in my research is basically trying to look at a more nuanced local context way that we can start designing how we can cater to the consumers within that space. So it's not so much as when the World Bank comes and gives you funding and says, go in and implement the Washington Consensus, make it look like a liberalized market for traditional utilities. Because within the past 10 years, we've realized that in addressing those issues and trying to come up with more green solutions for energy, we leave out the local residents, and the laws do not fit into our system. Why? Because we're looking so much at maybe states like Connecticut and other states to see how it's working for them, rather to see, look at the methods and the systems and try and fit it within the populations of the people that need it the most. So my research basically looks at the dynamics of the corporate structure within ISO New England, how they go about planning for resource development, also looking at how decarbonization by 2040, if that's possible, fingers crossed, how that looks like here, and how we can implement it in regions such as West Africa. I also look at issues such as resource planning, the greater conversation of global change and climate change in terms of adaptation and mitigation. And then I try and also apply that to my students who like to write papers. One of my favorite things to do is always open up the scope of letting them realize that instead of looking just at Connecticut, look at how we could take examples from Connecticut and compare them with other states and other countries. So I probably am going to be talking about the bigger picture, because think about it, the best way to think about what's working, and if it's working in Connecticut, is to say, how can we fit that piece in a place that isn't working and is outside our state. So I hope to bring that perspective and narration to today's conversation.
Thank you. I particularly love that because it's so easy to go do a panel like this and say, what's wrong, and then get a sense of what's good and we should bring to other places. So that's terrific. Last but by no means least, Manos, would you care to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. MANOS ANAGNOSTOU. I'm a professor of civil environmental engineering. My really far past is more on the science of hydroclimatic extremes. So I was for years doing research for NASA, I was in the science team of global precipitation measurement, and that's what kept me going for 15 plus years. But after, or actually close to Irene, I mean, when I started working with Eversource, I realized that there's a lot of needs in our communities generally, and there's a big knowledge gap that affects both decision-making, preparedness, investment. So I steer a lot of the research back to impacts of extremes on infrastructure, on society. So we did, after a significant actually effort, Jim actually worked a lot with the state. We worked with regulators and utilities. We convinced them that scientific knowledge and data analytics and predictions can help the decision making. So we worked to actually create a center of excellence. It was actually included in the two-storm panel that it was formed after Irene and the nor'easter.
Sandy.
Right, and that was an opportunity here to create something unique in the state. No other state, actually, no other place in the United States has such a strong partnership between a state organization, a major utility, and a university to create some analytics, some knowledge that will help decision making. So through the years, we developed models. We advanced early warning. We now provide real-time predictions on outages to Eversource and other utilities. Actually, we expanded that knowledge to the region. The whole New England actually now uses our approach. We moved to Mid-Atlantic. So this has become kind of a mode of operation for a lot of the utility industry. Now, why is that important to us here? Obviously, if you know a priori how impactful the storm is and where and what, you can expect that the utility will put appropriate resources there. Therefore, the restoration process can be faster, maybe less expensive, more, I would say, optimal. But at the same time, what we are actually trying to do to work with the communities and say, okay, where the criticalities are, right? Where do you need to invest more so that you don't see those future outages? The state government, as well as the federal and your rates, are going to pay the future infrastructure reinforcement, right? Billions of dollars. And oftentimes we're asked the question, what is the return to investment? And that's the most critical question that comes to any major investment we do for the future. So we try to help, basically, to provide those analytics tools that would not necessarily give answers to the utility, but use them as a driver for stakeholders, organizations, communities, to have a common base, common ground to negotiate, to discuss, and understand that that investment will have that return to my communities. Because there's no single solution. There's no single technology. Actually, there is a whole host of technologies, a whole host of solutions, and all of them need to be looked in a multifaceted way. There's no, there's the equitable and also environmental justice that you have to account. All of that, in order to be able to understand and quantify and even help create a basis for communication, you need to have some tools. And those tools, at least at UConn, we are trying to create and to a certain degree tailor them to the needs of the stakeholders, from the regulators to the utilities to the communities. So I can talk more about that, but that is what we do at the UConn Energy Center and UConn Tech Park with a large number of faculty and students who are working, and in collaboration with other centers too, CIRCA and other faculty at UConn, social science faculty, law school faculty, business school faculty. So it's an interdisciplinary and, of course, cross-sectoral effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Manos. So what I thought that we would do to kind of bring this into a little bit of relief, I should tell you that aside from my time here at the law school, where we get to work on a series of both national but state issues on this, in part of my past, I was an elected official in my town, Madison, where I was a zoning chair, and I was a selectman, but I was a selectman during Irene and Sandy. And those were very fraught times. And in some respects, I always feel like I've never left that table, you know, what it was like when we had no cell coverage. So I wanted to talk a little bit about each of your perspectives, because those were formative events, I think, for CIRCA and for a lot of our research agenda. And I wanted to think about, Manos, you talked about how there's, you know, so many things, and I thought maybe I'd circle back, Angie, to you. If you were to think about prioritizing some of the most immediate challenges from each of your perspectives, because I think it would be different, what makes your sort of top triage? I'm not going to be like top two, you know, you can't stop them anyway, you're free to pick whichever you want, but tell me what looks like from your spot, the most important challenges or difficult challenges facing the state right now. You know, what are the top couple that come to your mind?
Okay, so you asked.
With a little bit of fear.
Well, as the climate scientist, I promised earlier when we were talking about this that I would have to bring up as, you know, the most single top priority from the perspective of, you know, what are we going to end up with is how quickly can we get carbon dioxide emissions to zero in the state of Connecticut. But, you know, if we can do it, others can do it, and so we can be leaders because we've been emitting carbon dioxide for a long time, so we have a large footprint to consider historically. So I want to make the point that the amount of adaptation that is going to be necessary, the amount of changes in infrastructure and all of these other things, storms that we're going to have to deal with, is going to depend completely on how much carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. And I know Connecticut's little and we're not responsible for, you know, we can't do it all, but what we do here matters, and I'll say also Paschaline is saying it matters because everyone else is looking at us as leaders, and if we can do it, they can do it. So bending that curve as quickly as possible, as close to zero as possible, it has to be a priority because that will determine what all the other work is going to be. And then beyond that, I would say public health is super important because of the heat extremes that we're already experiencing and that are going to get worse. There's no question that they're going to get worse. And they're going to affect the people who are most vulnerable, as has already been suggested. So public health, and then the other thing is, water. Water is going to be either way too much or way too little, and both of those things are going to happen. So we have to learn how to manage that much more effectively. And of course, wind as well for MANOS and trees. So those are my things.
Thank you. So I hope you're getting a sense that, truly what we do in Connecticut actually does matter in terms of being our lack of county government, which is something we all grouse about, actually can serve as an advantage because we can be nimble. Part of that was the creation of CIRCA. I'm one of the directors of applied research, I think we all are, at CIRCA, where we work on a series of white papers and way to enable some of these changes. But Jim, your group's working with 150 towns on a regular basis. That number keeps amazing me. What comes to mind as the top couple from your perspective?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Angie. If we don't cap CO2 emissions in the near future, the Connecticut environment is going to be much different. There will be a lot of expenses that we'll have to incur. But even if we do cap CO2 emissions in the near future, sea level is going to continue to rise for the foreseeable future, probably 100 years at least. And it's unlikely that it'll be less than half a meter by 2100, and it could be up to half a meter by 2050. And it's likely that the mean temperature of the Connecticut is going to go up by 1.5 degrees centigrade, or maybe 2 by 2100. And there's very little we can do to stop that without inventing ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere rapidly and efficiently. So in addition to adapting our environment to and our way of life to a low CO2 emissions future, we also have to change a lot of other things in Connecticut and around the world. And Connecticut's probably going to be better off than many other parts of the world. And I'm going to focus on Connecticut because that's part of my job, right? But I really hope that personally in the near future I'll be able to work on other parts of the world where problems are great and things that we've learned here might be helpful. But in Connecticut, the most urgent thing I think is trying to get people to act. I've been director of CIRCA, executive director for CIRCA now for 10 years. And we've helped develop many projects, and most of the work has been about designing, identifying the problems, and this is what we've done with all the towns in Connecticut now. We've created a process by which we survey town people, the politicians, etc. We try and prioritize what things need to get done, and then provide people with options for ways to address those problems. And once you can cost which of them are going to take, figure out what people want, and then pick what the best solution that people really can agree upon is. Then you have to raise some money to execute the project, right? And even after you've done that, there are permits and design revisions, etc. And so in the 10 years that I've been working on this, I've only been to like 2 sites where actual projects have occurred. Now we've got 11 things underway right now in towns across the state, where we're trying to get to final design drawings that engineers can then take to make firm cost estimates and start the permitting process. And so that's the positive position. But there's another 100 projects that we've identified as needs to be done. And some of them get highlighted and moved up the importance pretty quickly. Like 4 weeks ago, the city of Norwich was not really too interested in participating in our program to help address flooding in the Chillicothe River. But all of a sudden, they are, right? Because of the flooding that's occurred. And it's not because they were stupid or anything. It's just the way political leaders change, and they have other problems, right? And in some towns, these problems associated with climate change are front and center. In other ones, there are health problems and pollution problems and economic development problems, and the mayor changes. These things slow things down. And even at the best of times, it's a slow process. So getting people to act soon and removing barriers to action, I think those are both legal and perceptional. These are things I think we need to work on, and that's not a physics problem, right? It's not the kind of thing that I know about, but I think the faculty at the university is probably one of the few places where the breadth of knowledge in economics and sociology and political science and law can help develop such approaches to reduce obstacles to action.
And truthfully, one of the things that seems to come at different junctures is convincing legislators and boards they actually have the power already. And what they really need is the guidance to understand the meats of and bounds of the solution. But they actually are sitting with the authority, or occasionally if they don't have the authority, we're able to help them. PASCHALINE, if you were to triage a couple of top climate issues you think make the most difference, either as things that you view as transferable or maybe even items educationally, what comes to the top of your list?
I'll definitely say climate justice, and probably I'll just start off with Connecticut. We all know like the impacts from climate change affects a marginal section of our community in terms of health and even in terms of sea level rise and most issues that we're talking about. But even for electricity, thinking about rates, we have some of the highest rates in the country. And we might trace it back to policy, but then we understand that it's being managed by a nonprofit organization. So then the actual question is what actually goes into these underlying policies. Just transferring that again back selfishly back to my research is also looking at how policy in itself has to be impacted by people at the core. So it's not just about having our stakeholders dictating laws and putting them in place, but it's also about going to the local communities. So sometimes for even Connecticut, it might be going to a section of the populations that are disproportionately bearing the brunt of the impacts and making sure that they have the power to actually have an impact in how we solve these issues, what that looks like in terms of money, and if that's going to impact them in their day-to-day activities. And for my home country where I come from, this is important because not only do we have issues with access to energy, but even in terms of climate, what might be an issue for Connecticut in terms of keeping the lights on for us is what firewood do we get to use in order to have lights today? So there are different issues that don't necessarily look the same, but if we're going to talk about the most important, it's definitely making sure that the people that actually matter, which is you and I, and the everyday people that actually get to turn on their lights and decide when the lights do come on the grid, we don't know if it's coming from solar or wind, but what we do know that the lights do come on, and we're grateful for that. But in terms of even paying for that access to energy, it's realistic in terms of what we're putting into our pockets or what we're paying our regulators. Also just making sure that the policies are fair and not disproportionate. And in the long run, just making sure that we are contributing to a society where we're considering the impacts that we're putting on our community, the global commons, not just our small communities within Connecticut, but how we're affecting the earth in general. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. And Manos, I think if we look for some top issues that come from you, or even things that are more significant issues now that weren't a few years ago, what shows up in your list?
Yeah, I would like to touch upon a few other aspects that I would say compound with some of the climate stresses that we just heard already. I would focus a lot on the workforce and changing and how we are actually shifting the workforce to these contemporary new topics that the society needs, especially when it comes to decarbonization and climate. And also the supply chain. I think we have experienced, those compound greatly, I would say, with our efforts to decarbonize. You already experienced the failure, I would say, of the offshore wind projects. There is how the economics and how those tie with the rates and eventually with the resilience and the sustainability. It's a very complex thing. I don't think there's a very straightforward solution to that. So my point, the point I want to make actually in general is that if you don't have the right expertise to push those solutions out, look at Europe. They have been working on this 20, 30 years already. And when the problem started, when we started shifting to the clean energy, they were already actually putting offshore wind farms. They were already putting solar farms. And when you want to get in there, you actually rely on their expertise. Anything we do right now, we are bringing experts from Europe. All the companies that are bidding, they're European companies. Okay? That's a big problem, I think. That's the greatest challenge. Transforming our universities, our educational systems, pushing them in this new direction is critical. How we do that? We need to invest more on human capital, number one, and expecting 5, 10 years from now to have that ready, all right? And the other thing is accelerating the investment and obviously the growth in this direction, the blue tech that we're talking about. And it's not just that. The next decade will be the decade of automation, of AI, of cyber, of data, of sensors. Cybersecurity would be a critical thing. How do you actually secure yourself against the biggest threats that can affect sustainability? So I'll leave it there. I hope I didn't scare you, but I think this is a thing. This is aspects that I know our state is governors or our state government is thinking about it. The universities are considering critically. The communities are discussing, but I think these are. We need to invest in that direction if we really want to address some of our climate resilience and problems.
Thank you. I think one of the other things that's come true is the number of things that are considerations that might not have been quite as manifest. Traditional land use patterns and zoning and city structures might not look at heat. We did a study in conjunction with the city of Norwalk? Denver. On trapped heat, patterns of heat, how we will have to start zoning for something that we took for granted before. A lot of that then, of course, manifested in EJ communities that were the ones that were the most challenged just by nature. Locations that we're doing for looking at where we put our peaker plants in as part of our broader grid. Things that we grew up for systems that weren't necessarily as tightly planned. And now today, in a climate challenged world, are part of our core policies, core research, things we need to respond to that'll become the tools of every town in a very short period of time. So I'd like to stop the back and forth among us. I mean, we'll talk all day. We all know each other. But I wanted to find out what's on your mind. So I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience.
Two questions. One, what is the percentage of renewable power in Connecticut? Does anybody know?
Manos, I turn over to you.
Yeah, that's a good. I thought I wouldn't get the hard questions. Anyway,
in that case, thank you very much. No.
very much. Ask Eversource.
I want to peg us about 20.
I'm loud enough.
Because we're running about 45% nuke.
We can search
45?
No, 10 to 20.
10 to 20.
Okay.
Yeah. No, 45 is the nuclear.
Oh, total. Okay. That's not bad. My second question is, we keep hearing about the American model this is probably for you, American model for climate predictions and the European model. I mean, by now everybody knows what the assumptions are. Why are there two different models?
So I think you're talking about the weather forecast models.
Weather, yes.
So there's the European
climate,
model and the National Weather Prediction Center model. And so I can talk to you offline with a lot more detail about this, but the problem is that the atmosphere for weather prediction is a chaotic system. And so there is never going to be a perfect model. There's never going to be perfect initial conditions for the model. And so every model is going to have slightly different assumptions and details. And it's actually been shown over and over again statistically that if you combine models, you will get the best results. And even with one model, you have to run them 100 times and then look at the spread of that model. So if you have 2 models, you actually can do better than one. And for climate, we actually have about 50
Okay, thank
around
you.
the world. Yes.
What else have we got? How about right here in front? Oh, who's got the mic? Oh, there we go.
So, David Hill, I'm a pulmonologist. So you've talked a lot about heat. And MANOS, don't apologize for frightening people, because people should be scared. I think air pollution is as big an issue as heat. We have the worst air pollution east of the Mississippi here. And June of 2022 is not that far away, if you remember stepping outside at 3 in the afternoon and saying, why are the lights on and why is the sky a strange shade? That was Canada on fire. It's all climate change. But my question, after the comment, as we transition to a zero carbon economy and look at the state of Connecticut, how do we ensure that we do this in an equitable fashion? If we go to clean cars, how do we make sure our communities that are the most effective have access? Because I fear that the last people driving gas vehicles will be the people most effective who should be able to have the right infrastructure to support what they need.
Yeah, you know, in the context of vehicles specifically, it starts to spin into such a complex series of policy issues, right? Every Subaru sold today is a 20-year commitment to delivering fossil fuels, right? Not to just pick on Subaru, but why not? You know, so every time they move one, and what happens to that car as it continues to issue particulates, as it works its way down and keeps getting recycled into an area that also becomes harder to insure. You may have seen Tesla some time ago started to try and announce its own insurance programs. They want to take those hyper radar camera, I own one, battery heavy cars and pull them out of the insurance market, making insurance ever more expensive for the other cars. It just becomes even more complicated in terms of EJ. Manos, did you have?
Equitability is a big question that, at least at the federal level, there, if you look at every investment, every development demonstration projects, it's central to it. If you don't account for that, you're not supported. So I'm sure the state has the same requirements. Communities of need or communities who cannot address resilience, for example, we have a priority in having either enhancing their resilience through microgrids, through systems that at least will provide, as we transition to DERs, which means distributed energy sources, will provide some form of support. Of course, we all understand that nothing can be done automatically for every community. It has to be done piece by piece. And understanding where you have the hotspots, where you really need to invest first, that's a very important aspect that needs to be presented. People need to understand how a particular investment in a particular area can help not only them, but also the surrounding areas, because everything is connected. So if you become resilient here, that means you release resources for somewhere else so people can restore faster. So it's everything is connected. So how do you ensure equitability and also energy justice it has to be integral part of the solutions that you study. So there's no single answer, but it's part of the solution.
Go ahead, Angie.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and I think it's probably along the same lines, that there are more ways to be mobile than in a car, right? And one of the things that we can do, collectively decide to do, is that we'd rather live in communities where we can walk and bike and maybe not need a car and set up some better public transportation so that it's not just those who can't afford it that are living in those places and need cars. So we can restructure the way we decide to live. And I think that there's also, I think the global, when we start looking globally, if everyone buys an electric vehicle, you know, and the way they're selling these things is they're monsters now, right? Like everything's an SUV. You can pose the question, is that equitable globally, that the global north is going to take all these resources for our EVs, and what is going to, you know, what does that do, again, for equity outside the U.S.?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, the thing I wanted to point out is that it's critical to get the electrical grid and its distribution system to residences revised in order to be able to carry the current that's necessary to heat and cool and charge cars. And at the moment, the existing grid is just inadequate, especially in the last mile. You know, you can drive down any town, through any town in Connecticut and see wires dangling from poles in all directions across the streets. And that network of distribution is just not capable of carrying the current necessary if everybody in an apartment complex had an electric car and electric heating system, an electric cooling system, an electric stove. And so there needs to be substantial investment and a redesign and an investment in distribution. And it's not going to be cheap, right? That's the thing that stymies it, because that investment in infrastructure of this type flies in the face of reducing costs. And the same is true with investing in new generation technologies. It's costly. But what's missed often is that the cost of doing nothing is also big, right? The cost of living in a warmer planet and the cost of a bit higher sea levels, that's high too, and it's distributed amongst a different group of people. And so deciding how to re-engineer our society to use electricity that allows us to generate power in a CO2 neutral way is a key issue that we should force our politicians to address.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to ask you to think a little bit beyond climate change. The things that we do in transitioning to sustainable clean energy is not only to address climate change, because if you focus it only on climate change, one can ask, what if China doesn't change? Then whatever you do in your little backyard may not have the same impact. But what it does on top of actually helping you reduce the CO2 emissions is giving you an energy independence. Think about it. You don't need the gas anymore. You don't need to import gas anymore. It's critical. In the long run, one can put it on the economic return. We can generate the massive amounts of electricity from offshore because we have, in this area, in the Northeast Atlantic area cluster, we have the largest capacity in the Atlantic and I think in big parts of the world. So all of that will give massive electricity and an energy independence the way that Hydro-Quebec is giving through Canada. Canada doesn't need anyone. They don't care about oil goes up or gas going up or wars here and there. They generate the electricity locally. They're independent. We can do the same thing here. And that will be a stronger sell to our communities and an important aspect for our economic growth and sustainability of our region as well as climate.
Thank you. Next question.
Looking at distribution of electricity, you were talking about the demand that's going to rise as we get more AI centers and electric demand from cars. The lines, the utility lines we have in the state now, are those privately owned?
I believe so.
So how would we move to the next level where you'd meet the demand? So I got to imagine it's got to be probably a doubling, if not more, of distribution to meet the future demand. Who would, if the state, would the state be able to take control and start building infrastructure, or would they have to incentivize Eversource and the other players?
Well, I'm the least qualified person to answer that, but I'm a professor. So,
Go right ahead.
So I'll try. Well, I think the market for both for distribution and generation is very regulated. Standards are set by state regulators, and the companies are kind of whine about it often and negotiate, but they can be forced to raise standards and change distribution types.
So I'm just going to add 2 cents to that. So currently, if you're unaware, PURA actually has a grid modernization docket that's going on. So they're working with the utility companies, so with Eversource, to try and make sure that we're trying to modernize the grid, meaning that we're trying to get the grid to a place where it's sustainable. Because we're talking about sourcing renewable energy, but we're forgetting the areas in which we're going to source these renewable energies are not necessarily in the communities that need them. So you have to think of ways to get it to the grid and how to make sure that the grid is well equipped for energy security, like to confront cybersecurity issues, but at the same time ensuring that there's resource adequacy. So you have ISO New England. That is, the way they distribute energy is very, very fascinating. And I don't just say this because I'm selfishly looking at them for my research, but they do it in a way where it's non-discriminatory, meaning that they don't care if it's wind, if it's power. They price it in a way where investors are actually very interested in coming up with these long, they call it the capacity market, these long-term contracts to be able to make sure that states like Connecticut have enough power to meet the demand for a particular range of years. So as we're talking at this moment, there's an interesting graph or board going on in ISO New England where they're trying to match demand. So like MANOS said, and I think it's very important that even though we're talking about trying to get to a clean energy mix, we're not just thinking about it in terms of reducing our climate impacts, but also energy security, which is a huge thing. And if you're aware about the Ukrainian war that's going on, we see that impacting Europe. And they're now actually having to rethink their whole energy strategy. So in terms of a region and a state, it's not just energy security, but grid modernization is also very key to help us get to that realization of reducing emissions and as well as improving our resource adequacy.
And if I can
Yeah,
put in...
and the grid modernization is a big topic. It's not just power lines. There's a lot of new technologies out there that are being tested, like dynamic line rating. We can use the same power lines. Power lines have a lot of capacity. It's just that for security purposes, we can only use a percentage of that. Because imagine what will happen if you overload it, right? You get a massive cascaded outage. So utilities are very conservative. But if you have the right sensors and the right technology and the right IEI and predictive models, you can push the limit to actually utilize more of those power lines. So you don't need always to build new power lines, you just need to build better technology for that. The other thing is the massive storage that comes with the renewable electricity that's generated by wind and solar. And you've heard a lot about the hydrogen, right? And University of Connecticut is actually very much engaged in hydrogen hub technologies and storage technologies that will be actually facilitated by hydrogen. So there is a lot in the next decade that will actually facilitate those renewable energy sources coming into the grid and the communities.
And I would say that I want you to think of the grid. In Manos's world, the grid has capacity and wires. In mine, the grid is a regulatory device. It is the markets and the way that we pay for energy. Your Eversource, congratulations, your UI. You don't know which electron went where in our grid. We have a market created by laws, created by lawyers that require new investment, capacity markets. We bid on markets for the future. These are the creations of policy and law. And trying to be nimble and aggressive and thoughtful about those will guide the investments that help us do a lot of these other things. You all remember when Texas went dark. Their capacity market needed refinement in terms of it's always easy to keep utility costs low. You just don't invest. That investment is a regulatory structure. The market that we create is a bunch of regulatory and legal mechanisms that we use to try and be fair to encourage updating, but also to pay for the power that people sell. It exists as a matter of, I'll pitch the lawyers, it exists as a matter of the lawyers. Who else?
My name's Susan Murphy. I don't totally understand, but with electric cars, the little bit I've read is the components of the batteries come from other countries. So how could that help us become independent, or like if there's shortages of those components, what impact would that have?
It doesn't. Not for the electric cars, but even that may change in the future.
Yeah, there's projects to take lithium out of near shallow soils and gather it that exists in small quantities. We know one thing: if we don't have an electric car, then the cars that we're building have one source, right? They have gas. If you have a car that can take juice, how we store it and how we get the juice can be updated faster. So, but you're not wrong. Right now, it's a big challenge. Yeah. Sorry, Manos, I didn't mean to step
No,
on your case.
no, I wanted to say that people are also studying alternative, renewable or clean cars like hydrogen technologies, and UConn is very much involved in that. Alternative fuels. So there's multiple ways that you can become independent. Obviously, lithium batteries, ion batteries is one of them, and obviously not the one that we generate in our area.
Go ahead. Luke.
Hi, Professor. It's great to see you again. My question...
He just suffered through con law for a couple hours. So.
He did. Preemption was today, but it was great. My question pertains to nuclear energy. Given the realities of the modern energy demands of an economy, do you believe the future is nuclear in the United States and beyond?
My answer might not be popular, but I actually do. I think the fear with nuclear has to do with technology, and I think it's more about awareness. And I know a lot of my colleagues disagree with this, but I believe that we have the technology to now come up with safety measures and safe ways to produce nuclear. And if we're thinking technically in terms of clean energy, then nuclear might be the way to go. Also, storage, I know, is a huge issue, especially in the United States. But then we could look, again, I like always to do a comparative analysis to the way the European countries are actually utilizing those storage technologies to make sure that it's safe. So I am a huge proponent of nuclear energy when it comes to adding that to the energy grid.
I will say one thing about nuclear power. So we frequently get in a renewable energy law class or in climate law. Why can't we have the same reactors that they have in Europe? The reason was regulatory for a long time. 3 Mile Island, you remember the very minimal but still frightening release, created a regulatory scheme that locked us into big nuclear power chambers with 2 separate piercings and ways to bring in backup coolant. Only recently, and a student who was here many years ago became interested in this and became involved in the regulatory process on nuclear. And it was now 7 or 8 years later, I got a little text from her the other day. I fixed it. And it was actually probably the most delightful small text I've ever gotten in my life. They had worked for all those years to open the regulatory scheme and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission so that some of those smaller reactor styles are now modernized and can be used. So that's a regulatory answer, but even at that, if we all got together to build one today, the time frames, the project scales are extremely long.
So there's an interesting occurrence that happened in the state legislature about 4 years ago. It was when Millstone was considering closing down. And the environmental NGOs in Connecticut lobbied hard with Connecticut DEP to allow Millstone to extend their license for another decade, because they realized if Millstone closes down, we're going to have to continue to burn coal and gas longer. And so whether or not in the long term, big plants like Millstone are going to be feasible economically, I don't know. Again, it's not my area of expertise. But it's certainly a plausible alternative, and there are considerations of some new, and the law was changed in Connecticut recently to allow new reactors on sites where reactors already exist. So the door is open in Connecticut, and roughly 20 to 40%, depending on what time of day, of the electricity we use in Connecticut is generated by Millstone. So it's a tough thing to lose.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is environmental justice. Where are these things located? And what does that do? You know, are you willing to have a nuclear power plant in your neighborhood?
Yeah, and not the least of which the storage problems remain significant.
Well, I think they can be sorted out, but I'm not opposed to nuclear. I just think that if we're serious about it, we should be willing to have it in our neighborhoods, right? Like, don't push it off onto the vulnerable neighborhoods where, which we've been doing, you know, for decades.
Question? Oh, go ahead.
I guess is it on? Okay. Hi, I'm Charlie Wynot from Glastonbury. We have a couple of local issues in our community that I'd like to know what you think about them and how we can debate them in our government and in our local communities. One is there's a proposal to build a couple of turf fields for the high school. And then there's a counter group that wants to see grass fields for the high school and not turf fields. There are environmental pluses with the grass, but there's also an opposing side about how to play sports on turf and giving the best to our high school athletes. We also have just recently received notice that 15 acres on some farmland wants to be turned into a solar farm. It's a 45-acre site, and the local people who live within a few hundred feet in some cases have already turned out and said, wow, I don't know if we should have this near my house. So the whole NIMBY attitude is prevalent. I have two other questions. One is, I've heard of a proposal to build perhaps a grid through Long Island Sound for offshore wind, and I want to know if you've heard of that and what you think of that. And the last question I have is, what do your students and former students think of the future? Are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic? What is their attitudes?
Well,
were you writing those down?
Sure. So I'm totally going to bump the turf and field issue. Unless we have a grass scientist on here, we're moving that right along. I will tell you that it was something that we talk about a lot. There's an energy component under CIRCA as well. And the state's been very worried about is the installation, is the loss of something really important. Open farmland that provides drainage. It's kind of what we live for, to have outside, into solar uses. And I wish there was like an easy formula to say, oh, well, you balance this versus that. It simply doesn't exist that way. There are trade-offs with it. People tend to go to open areas because they're easier to develop. I do think that the plans that provide incentives for rooftop and brownfield areas for solar that have existed successfully in many states, and including this one, are preferable, right? But sometimes also for parts of the area, I was surprised in talking to our friends at the Ag School that when we were doing a Food in Our Changing Climate conference some years ago, and I met with several of the professors at the Ag School, and they sort of caught me up short. They said, the number one problem with food production, I'm like, yes, I'm thinking it's going to be climate or rain. I was going to call you. And they said, energy policy. We need more energy and capacity near where the farms are. A lot of that's open space. So that's a total descriptive non-answer to your issue on that piece. But I'll open up maybe the student issue, or whichever one you'd like to answer. Go ahead, Angie.
Yeah, so I can say that I live in Tolland, Connecticut, and right down the street from my farm was a farm that became a solar farm, and that energy supplies, I believe, the town. So the town put that in to create electricity for their municipal usage. And I love it. I think it's great. You know, I don't think that there's been any issues with the local people there. As far as students go, I think there is a you know, a wide variety of responses to the future. But I can tell you, because I'm a climate scientist and I teach climate to a lot of students at UConn, there is a lot of so-called climate anxiety. And it's getting worse all the time. So I've seen, anecdotally, I can say that I've seen students who are like absolutely honors, top performing students that just, they kind of fell off the face of the earth and didn't finish a lot of the things that they had wanted to do. And one of the last times I saw this person in particular, he told me, I'm having so much anxiety I can't even function. And it was at a meeting with faculty about talking about climate change and research on climate change. So it's very real. Some people feel it more than others. I think people who tend to be more sensitive and focused on these issues are definitely feeling that. And we have to, in our classrooms, we have to talk about the emotional toll and the positive changes that we are making, and give students things to work with, which we're trying to do. But I think the best thing we can do is make changes so that they can feel more hopeful. That's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
We have last summer we called for a challenge competition on clean energy sustainability. We had close to 70 students apply. We picked 6 teams, 3 students in each team that, and all of them came with very diverse solution approaches. And we gave them a summer to work on and presented it at the summit that we had in October. It was quite, I can tell you they're eager to see change, but they're also very knowledgeable. I think they look at a lot through their courses, with their faculty advisors, but also through the groups that they have at UConn, very, very active groups. We know a lot of the challenges, and they're trying to actually, they're voicing their solutions or their opinions. So that challenge competition gave them an opportunity to see how this could potentially grow or have a path to an implementation, right? So we are working on this. I want to see what will happen next, like the next summer, because these students now are ambassadors in the program, and they're actually working with other students. But I agree with the opinion that we need to also to show change. Like, we cannot just keep on talking about that, right? Especially at UConn. So one of the things that we are trying hard to do is to implement real changes. So they're in the Discovery Drive, where you enter UConn, basically your entrance to one of the entrances to you, the main entrance. We're going to be implementing solar canopies across the parking lots. We're going to do a microgrid there with the Innovation Parks and Building having on the south side commercial scale fuel cells, hydrolyzers for generating hydrogen. So we're gonna actually become independent of Eversource, and to a certain degree generating electricity for the campus. And more importantly, the students will see that things are happening. Things are going. It's just the beginning. It's only a small percentage of our electricity use. Eventually, students want to see what will happen to our combined heat electricity system. But at least things become more visible, and as they become visible, then we can see how efficient we are, how fast we can grow, and what's the cost and everything. So, yeah,
There are 2 questions you asked that I do feel technically competent to address. The one about the cables and oil and sand is the first one, and currently I'm leading a big project to map high resolution ecosystems that are present in Long Island Sound. And we've been working on it for about a decade with a series of grants. And I've been involved with providing information to consulting firms who are making recommendations on where the cable should go. So there's a lot of careful analysis going into the proposals for the routes. And then about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I was working on measuring the suspended sediment that was resulted from a cable laying operation between New Haven and Long Island. And there is a detectable signal in the suspended sediment, but it's managed pretty well. The duration when they can do it is limited so that they don't affect fisheries resources very much. So overall, the bottom line is I don't think it's a serious problem. And what should be much more dangerous was the proposal for a floating gasification plant that was in eastern Long Island Sound about a decade ago. I think that was a bad idea. But so the second thing I want to comment on is a grass field.
Oh. That's not what I was going to guess. Go ahead.
Yeah, I retired from the over 40s Connecticut Soccer League when I was 60. So I played fields all over the state, and I have a high priority for grass fields. And the older you get, the more important grass is relative to the turf.
So, like tomorrow you'll be, I went to a climate thing. What did they talk about? The grass fields are really good.
Really good for soccer. No, but there is a real question about the use of pesticides and nitrogen on them. So you have to manage that carefully and make sure the runoff isn't concentrated into streams, etc. But there are professionals that know how to do this in a way that is acceptable. And like everything else, there's a trade-off. And if the trade-off is you don't get to play soccer, then it's a tough thing for me to agree to.
Hello, my name is James. I'm a recent graduate from CLAS. I actually designed my own major. It's sustainability and climate change. It's an individualized major. I always called it kind of like a cross between the studies and sciences. But my question, it's kind of more of a general question. There's always this conversation between adaptation and mitigation, what's the right choice? And, obviously in different places of the state, one decision is going to be more important versus another place, like Tolland, they're going to have different problems versus Bridgeport or Hartford even. So in terms of Connecticut, where do you think we stand with adaptation and mitigation? Do you think policy will be able to keep up fast enough with these dramatic changes in the climate? And how do you think we should kind of navigate that question of, is it too late to mitigate? Is it too soon to adapt? How do you think we should navigate that?
Can I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's never too late to mitigate. Never, ever, ever. Everything that we can do will help. And there is no point at which we give up because, again, the more CO2 we put into the atmosphere, the worse things are going to get. And it's not going to stop getting more worse. We want to stop, it's like digging a hole. We want to stop digging the hole so that we don't have to, so we can start fixing the problems, right? So it's never too late to mitigate. We have to adapt already, as Jim has said, and maybe he would want to articulate that again, but it's too late to not adapt. We can say that. We're already in climate change, and we have to do adaptation. We have to become more resilient. But how much we are going to need to do is going to depend on how much we mitigate.
So I believe, just to add to what Angie said, it's both. It's both adaptation and mitigation. And fortunately enough, we are in a state that, in terms of policy, the governor has done a lot with pushing policy out. We have the Global Solutions Act. The Governor's Council is very, very well equipped when it comes to having stakeholders that are well versed and have the expertise in this area, that they come up with laws. And we have the sea level. I think that's another tremendous act, but where we confront sea level rise in CIRCA. It's actually one of the great examples of an institution that's born to actually tackle adaptation versus mitigation, right? So it's not about choosing one over the other. I like to think about climate solutions as a toolbox. So it's which tool is best fitted for the job, and it's both of them and some. So it's about adding more proactive decision-making, policy-making into that toolbox, and both mitigation and adaptation are very useful when it comes to that.
I definitely agree with that, except for I see it more like a soccer game where you have to play offense and defense simultaneously. And so I see myself as leading the defense and the adaptation side of the problems that generated by climate change. And, but we can't do one without the other, right? We're going to have to adapt or pay a price, irrespective of what else we do. And if we don't mitigate rapidly and substantially, then the price that the adaptation is going to cost is going to be higher, both in lives and money and pain and suffering.
Adaptation, I want to give you an example. We did a study, we just published it recently on the precipitation extremes across the entire corners, the continental United States, and the picture is not good because we all know that some areas precipitation will go up, but in terms of the extremes, the return period, so the frequency of reoccurrence of, let's say, an event that is once every 50 years, in some parts of the US, it's going to be reoccurring every 10 years in terms of heavy precipitation. Now, imagine how this would put pressure on the water infrastructure. So all of that already has happened. This is not climate change. This is not climate projections. These are actually current data, right? If you look at the projections and do the same study on the projections, things become worse. But just think about what is already happening, right? So adaptation should be happening already. Anything we have, any water infrastructure is designed based on 30, 40 years ago. And a lot of those design specs are not valid anymore. And the same thing goes with the electric grid, goes with transportation, with a lot of sea level rise actually is making things even worse in the coastal areas. So we need to think of the adaptation very seriously. And of course, make sure that we somehow stop this from accelerating, from happening even worse, because the climate projection data draw a much grayer picture. So I agree, the faster the more aggressively you mitigate, the less will be the cost in the future, but already we're paying a big price today.
So I guess I would close that with what we do here matters. Connecticut is so small, so you think, why do we worry about mitigation? Because what we do here matters. We are in a position, it's good to be us. We've had multi-administrations who support renewable energy and climate. We went from a confused sea level rise law that was arithmetically wrong to one of the few that's informed by science. We have projections on rainfall, sophisticated grids, and even at that, we're struggling. But to the extent that we are mitigating, adapting, being resilient in the structure that we have, we can export what we do to other places if we get it right, and we're nimble enough to steal other people's ideas if they get it right. So we have to do both because it matters, and we're in a very good place to try and make the most of it. We're sitting here at a table where behind each of us is a center, an activity, a lot of students on climate, and I think for each of us would have a story on maybe when it was a bit thinner, a decade and some ago. And yet now it's something that our students are incredibly interested in. They come here, they study it across all levels. There are online master's programs with 100 students. There are people in my own area that come from all around the globe to study in this area, and this is true for all of us. We have PhDs working in all of our various departments. So it's a very big effort, and we have to look at all of it because it matters for what it's here. And what also matters is if you join me to thank our panelists for coming out and spending the evening with you. And I'd like to thank the foundation and thank all of you. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.